In Section 2 of Unit 1, you will identify the practitioner's model of instructional design that we use in this book, and it's also called the rocket science model in Fun. You will also identify the academic and classic textbooks and models of instructional design. You will identify the common elements of all instructional design models, and you'll read an example of ADDIE and how it's applied to puppy training. We're now going to look at the rocket science ID model, which I've also called the practitioner ID model. The rocket science model is a title that I named in Fun. It's a technical illustration that I created of the instructional design process. And looking on the screen right now, you really can't see this in any great detail. So somewhere in your learning environment for this unit, I've included this picture so that you can look at it in greater detail. The detail in the image is derived from many classic readings and other textbooks, which you'll see in just a minute. Sometime during the process of creating this illustration, our local newspaper quoted our dean, Eugene Sheehan, as saying, "Education is not rocket science. It's far more complicated." This seemed like the perfect quote for this illustration because I was trying to make something very complicated seem easy. This was proving to be a huge challenge. I do think I succeeded in capturing the complexity of design in this image. The complexity exists because exceptional design of education in all likelihood is harder than rocket science. These are 3 respected textbooks in the discipline of instructional design, and they all cover the same process. Each chapter in each of these books covers topics that are actually entire books on their own, making this topic of instructional design overwhelming. Students have a hard time seeing how all the different chapters in the book fit together, so when they're finished with the class, they are not quite sure what it is that they've learned. Most of the time they can describe the process, but they do not really see a connection between process and design. Traditional models of instructional design use a flowchart to describe the instructional design model, and they focus on hierarchical and highly sequential depictions of the design process. So each box in the process is actually broken down into sub-boxes or sub-tasks. Let's look now at another classic instructional design textbook, the Morrison, Ross, Coleman, and Kemp book. You'll notice that this model shows itself as a circle, and that is so that it looks like the process is not linear. There are 9 phases identifying instructional problems, identifying learner characteristics, identifying tasks, identifying instructional objectives, sequencing the content, creating instructional strategies, designing the message, developing the instruction, and using evaluation instruments to determine how effective the instruction was. The practitioner's model that we're going to study, it focuses on 2 types of people. One is a designer, which is you, and the other is the learner, who the designer is creating instruction for. All of the models that I've covered, the circle model of Kemp, Morrison, Ross, the more flowchart looking models, and even the model we study in this class, the rocket science model, they all have in common this process we call ADDIE. You see the linear model divided into 5 phases of ADDIE, and here you see the 5 phases of ADDIE identified in the Morrison model. And then our rocket science model is the same. So all these models have in common ADDIE. So let's look at ADDIE applied to puppy training. During the analysis phase, the designer asks things like, does the dog owner know the sit command? Has the dog owner owned a dog before? They'll ask questions like that. During the design phase, the instructional designer will say, what are our learning goals and objectives? What is it exactly we want to do with this training? During the development phase, the instructional designer might say something like, let's create a worksheet and a training calendar. During the implementation phase, the instructional designer is talking about what's going on at that point in time. And they'll say things like, well, we'll do the first lesson tomorrow. During the evaluation phase, the instructional designer asks things like, well, did it work well? What should we change? What should we keep? But what I want you to really think about right now is that we're going to take a 21st century focus here. And our model is going to look at 3 best practices. Focus on the learner's cognitive load. What does the learner already know, and how do we present information so that they are most likely to learn? We're also going to focus on learning environments, and that is where we are creating instructions and instructional settings where learners learn from the content, as they always have, but they also learn from other learners, and they learn from interacting with the teacher, the instructor, the facilitator, and they also interact with an interface, such as you are doing right now as you're watching YouTube. And then last, we're going to focus on usability testing, which I mentioned before, and that is this sort of cyclical process of analyzing how effective, efficient, and appealing instruction is. Okay, let's wrap up Unit 1. You've learned to define an instructional designer. It's somebody who uses a process to analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate instruction so that it is effective, efficient, and appealing. The overall purpose of instructional design is to help people learn and to help them perform. We've compared the profession of the instructional designer to that of an architect. And we also talked about the benefits of belonging to a profession, to sharing a specific language. We've looked at a practitioner's model of instructional design, and we've identified the classic books and models of instructional design, and also the common elements that exist in all of those design models. And then we've applied those common elements very quickly to the types of things an instructional designer does as they create puppy training.